Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant and Jerry Gordon. Here on Israel News Talk Radio. Unplug, strap yourself in, because you are about to move beyond the Matrix.
We have officially arrived here at Beyond the Matrix on Israel News Talk Radio. Thank you for all of you guys that are watching us on YouTube at Nativ, N-E-T-I-V, online, one word, Nativ Online, at YouTube. And you'll be able to watch us live every time we have a show on this day. Jerry, we have a very interesting guest that we've never heard from, though she's probably pretty familiar to some of our listeners. And the organization she represents also is an organization we've talked about before called EMET. So tell us about our guest.
Our guest is the founder and principal head of the Endowment for Middle East Truth, in Hebrew, EMET. And EMET has been, over the past 15 years, a powerful voice in Washington, a force multiplier for peace in many ways, but also the truth about Israel, relationships with America. And it's also been innovating significant legislation and projects, one of which we heard today, which was a bipartisan bill introduced to nourish the very same normalization that the UAE Israeli Abraham Accords has rocked the Middle East on. So she's a very important, calm voice, but persistent, advocating for Israel, the U.S.'s ally in the Middle East, and expressly nourishing peace.
Yes, and one of the exciting things that we find out about EMET, the actual organization that does this, is they work very hard to, they're not a lobbying organization, they work very hard to keep our congressmen and senators, etc., informed of what is the truth about what's going on in Israel, which is very important. And also, Jerry, you and I have been dedicated to bringing EMET, and that is the truth, the Hebrew word for truth, into the public forum so that we can see some kind of change. We've talked everything from the Kurds all the way over to the Palestinians, and we are still very hopeful that one day Israel will have peace with their Palestinian neighbors, and that we'll see peace and prosperity come to those people that are in the region. So it's a big hope. Guys, you listen to Beyond the Matrix. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after these messages.
G'day, I'm Jono Vandor.
And I'm Ross Nichols.
Join us on our program, Israel on My Mind, a show that broadcasts all the weekly goodness that flows like milk and honey from the Holy Land straight into your ears with humorous and happy news stories.
New shows are posted every Thursday at 7 p.m. Israel time, highlighting the lighter side and advancing a positive view of Israel here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
And you are back here after the break. Thank you so much. I'm Rod Bryant, along with Jerry Gordon, my trusted sidekick and producer. What a great guy. And he got up, he got his makeup on, took a shower this morning. We're so happy for him. It's that time of the month, so he's got to take a shower at least once a month, and so we're glad he's here. And also our very special guest, Sarah Stern. Sarah, we have been really excited about talking to you after I read the article that you just recently produced talking about the Palestinian State and how it's put them in an odd situation since the UAE has sort of joined in with Israel with a peace agreement. Before we get started, I would like you to take a moment. Now, I know with Dillerman we've talked about EMET, but could you tell us what is the Endowment for the Middle East Truth? What is it about?
Okay, EMET is a 15-year-old, unabashedly pro-Israel and pro-American, pro-Western democracy think tank and policy institute in Washington, D.C. We write and publish. We come up with at least one article a week that we have published, all over. I've published anywhere from the New Republic to Breitbart and everything in between. Newsweek, a lot in jns.org, Israel Hayom, Israel Today, the Jerusalem Post. We meet with members of Congress every day, and we've been very popular during the COVID-19 pandemic, essentially because there's very little that's being done in terms of foreign policy. And I think the foreign policy staffers are bored and lonely, and they want to talk to me. And when something breaks in the Middle East, as it did last week, they want to talk to me. So we have about 2 or 3 or 4, sometimes up to 6 phone calls a day with staffers, mostly staffers, sometimes members of Congress on Capitol Hill. And we have webinars once a week where we've had everyone from David Albright, who is the head of the Institute for Science and International Security, talking about the mysterious spate of bombings earlier this summer in Iran, to Tony Bajan, who was born in Lebanon, who's works for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, is a Lebanese analyst, and many wonderful mutual friends of ours like Yoram Ettinger, Ephraim Inbar, wonderful analysts. And, we work really hard to tell the EMET, to tell the truth.
Perfect word. And for people that don't know, EMET means truth in Hebrew. And that's the whole point. It's a great acronym. By the way, while we're on this idea, how impactful has EMET been in keeping Washington policy and political communities informed?
Impact is a really, really difficult thing to evaluate, but we know that a lot of our ideas have resulted in legislation. We're not lobbyists. We do support a few bills, but we're limited in the amount of lobbying because we're a 501c3. But we know, for example, one of the things that we were responsible for was amendments to Title VI of the Higher Education Act, which said that before the Middle Eastern studies programs that are being taxpayer funded through this legislation, before they get the money, they have got to prove that they have a wide range of viewpoints and a diversity of perspectives. We passed this legislation, this amendment, and we're still working right now. We need a GAO report because that legislation was passed in 2008. But our work resulted in the opening up of an office in the Department of Justice pursuant to the murder of my friend Sherry and Seth Mandel's son, Kobe Mandel. And this office is the Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism, because prior to the opening of this office, and still to quite an extent until today, the Americans that have been murdered by Palestinian terrorists have been regarded as pawns on some huge chessboard. And I had thought that if the name on the door said justice, there would be more of a crack at pursuing justice. And up until now, we have been working particularly for the extradition of Aklam Tamimi, who was a terrorist who was responsible for the Sparrow Pizzeria bombing, which occurred on August 9th, 2001, where she scoped out the place, brought the suicide bomber, Izzadin al-Masri there, and she particularly liked the place because she said a lot of young Jewish families eat there, a lot of young Jewish religious families, she said. And this resulted in the murder of 15 civilians and the maiming of hundreds more. And of those murdered, 2 were American citizens. One was Malki Roth, who was 15 years old, and one was Judith Greenbaum, who was 31 years old and pregnant at the time. And a third American, Hannah Nachenberg, remains in a vegetative state to this day. And Ahlam Tamimi actually was freed from prison, unfortunately, as a result of the Gilad Shalit deal with 1,027 other terrorists. And she flew to Jordan, where she was greeted at the airport and showered with flowers and treated as a conquering hero because of her dastardly acts. And she was given her own television show. And we have worked for her extradition, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that he wants the extradition. It hasn't happened yet. We sent a letter this summer with, I think, about a dozen congressmen that signed it to Dawa Kawar. Dina Kawar, who is the Jordanian ambassador. But she has not responded to any of the members of Congress that asked for Ahlam Tamimi's extradition. So it's hard to measure. We know that we have great relationships with many members of Congress on Capitol Hill, and even, with liberal Democrats, except for, the extreme radical squad, which we have no desire to talk to, and we can't get into their offices anyway. So.
Yeah, I was getting ready to say, if you could even get in the office, that would be good. Jerry, go ahead. We have about 3 or 4 minutes left in this segment. Go ahead.
So you wrote this article, and the question is, why is the ground shifting underneath the Palestinian feet at this point, my dear?
Yes, this is something we have long awaited. Unfortunately, the Palestinians have been granted much too much power, the power to say no, to refuse, even before the birth of Israel in 1948. Palestinian rejectionism has basically stymied the waters of any kind of peace deal that the Israelis have wanted to embark upon. Of course, with Menachem Begin in 1979, he returned the Sinai Peninsula. So there was a peace deal with Anwar Sadat in Egypt. And then in 1994, after the PLO or the PA had embarked on the Oslo Accords, Jordan did have a peace treaty in 1994. However, that was a they're both extremely icy cold peace treaties. And of course, people are happy that there's not a hot war. But I've looked at translations of the textbooks. I don't speak Arabic, but I've seen translations of the textbooks from Egypt and the PA, and they are as rife with anti-Semitism as anything that would come out of Der Stürmer. We are extremely happy today that the center of gravity has shifted. And I could just say that on July 25th, 2000, I was in the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and the Attorney General Eliakim Rubinstein came to address the group. And he's a friend of mine. He's a lovely man. And he said, we went about as far as any responsible Israeli government could go in what we offered. He said, in fact, some people would argue that we weren't being responsible. And he said, our logic was if we just made an offer that Arafat could not refuse, he wouldn't. And the offer, the Clinton perimeters were incredibly maximalist. And he didn't say yes, he didn't say no, he just walked away from the table, which has made any future negotiations between the PA and Israel very difficult, because how could the Palestinian Authority ever walk away with less? And how can an Israeli interlocutor offer that much, particularly since the Gaza withdrawal and all of the years of violence that have ensued ever since?
And we know that each succeeding Israeli government since that time has attempted to roll out a more luscious plan to have them just turned down over and over. And one of the things that we talked about in the break is the fact that it's gotten to the point now, it looks like they've become irrelevant in the discussion between Israel and the Arab states. And we can talk about that a little bit more. We have to go to a break, guys, so don't go anywhere. We want to also thank those who watch us on YouTube. You can go, if you want to watch today, go to Netiv, Netiv online, one word, Netiv online, and you can watch the video there as well. Make sure that you subscribe right here, and also take time to send us a couple of messages on the chat. Okay, guys, we'll be back right after these messages.
Hi everyone, this is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
Modesty at the beach? It isn't just about body image. It's about feeling good. Modest swimsuits, so we don't get burned by the sun.
So we won't get ogled by strangers.
So we'll feel free to express ourselves without the need to expose ourselves.
Let Marcy Modest help you to cover up what you want, how you want.
Made in Israel.
Visit marcymodest.com. That's MARSEA modest.com.
And get a 10% discount on your first purchase.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
I'm Rod Bryant, and welcome to the second segment of Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio. And if you're watching us on YouTube, thank you so much for watching as well. We have Sarah Stern, and she's from the organization EMET, which is Middle East Truth. And so we are trying to bring some truth to the whole situation. And where did we leave off, Jerry? Where do you want to pick up?
Well, basically, let's pick up with a couple of remarks from our break. And one of them is, Sarah, you were kind of over the moon about this break that occurred with the adoption of the so-called Abraham Accords between the UAE and Israel. And I also noticed that even the Palestinians who are living in the UAE support this. And we also referred to an amazing 11-year-old rapper in Gaza saying, hey, gang, how about peace with Israel? That kid's life may be shortly expired.
Yeah, no doubt.
But tell us essentially what the breakthrough means to our listeners.
Well, this is incredibly encouraging, not only in terms of state-to-state peace, but also in terms of people-to-people peace, of a normalization of relations, which is something that's lacking in the peace treaty. It's in the peace treaty, but in the actual carrying out of the treaties, it's ignored in the treaties between Egypt and Israel and Jordan and Israel. But on Thursday, I was privy to a discussion with the foreign minister of the UAE, and he said, we have had no wars with Israel, as opposed to Egypt and Jordan, where it's still part of their national psyche, their national consciousness. We want a war and peace. They want people-to-people contacts. In fact, one of the things that we're working on currently is a piece of legislation that just came out, sponsored by Senator Rob Portman of Ohio and Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. And it will require the State Department to keep a list of those nations in the Middle East that work against normalization activities of a people-to-people contact. And what we find so exciting is the new age media, where young people are actually communicating young people throughout the Muslim and Arab world are communicating with Israelis and finding out about Israelis through Facebook and through Twitter and Instagram and other things. So they have other avenues of communication beyond what the state has wanted them to believe. And we were talking about this young rapper, this 11-year-old Abdul Rahman al-Shakir, I think his name is, Al-Shanti. And his father has been threatened, unfortunately, because he was he lives in Hamas-controlled Gaza, and he was rapping about peace and loving Israelis. And I think this really is, like, as you said, Jerry, a ray of light in the darkness. There's a crack of opening that the sunlight can really shine through in. And I think there is going to be a time where there's going to be just a blossoming of more and more relations on the state to state. I think that Oman, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the Sudan will crack or they will. I shouldn't say crack because that has a negative connotation. But the wall of hatred will crack, and there'll be an opening up. In fact, I was really honored last January to be invited into the White House when President Trump unveiled his vision for peace, and seated right in front of me were the ambassadors of the UAE and of Oman and of Saudi Arabia. I was delighted to see them there. They didn't applaud. They sat very stiffly, but they were there. And I thought that was a great indication. And I think that this is possibly the opening of many, many more peace agreements to come, particularly within the Gulf Arab world.
You know, we had talked during the break that that social media and the internet has become probably one of the greatest vehicles to peace. Let me explain why. I have on my Facebook page a number of Muslim and Arab people on Facebook, and they see my page. I see their page. We comment on each other's pages occasionally. But the whole point is they're getting to see a different view from their myopic view where they have been. And hopefully and prayerfully, peace and prosperity is going to be so enticing that it just doesn't make sense to make war anymore. And God willing, we'll see that in this generation. There has been some good news come out for EMET, and that is the potential of having a new what we call new asset to come to work for EMET. Could you tell us about the story? And if we have to go into a break, we'll go to a break and come back and finish it after. Go ahead.
Right. We are very excited because we are about to hire Hussein Abubakar Mansour. Hussein came from an extremely religious, conservative Muslim family. His parents were Bedouins. They moved to Cairo. His brother is an imam, a jihadist imam. He encourages jihadists. And when he was a very young boy, he had the fascination with curing the world, ridding them of these evil Jews. So he went into a museum in Cairo to find out about these evil Jews. This museum came about as a result of the 1979 peace accord between Egypt and Israel. And it's tiny, but he started reading about the Holocaust and Elie Wiesel and Martin Buber and Gershom Scholem. He said, these people are not evil, they're brilliant and they're wonderful. He met another friend of mine who was going for his PhD at Tel Aviv University. And because of that, the Secret Service had seen him and had interrogated him and his father, arrested him. He had been tortured, and then he was inducted into the army, and he was tortured even more. And he did get political asylum under President Obama, and his first job was teaching at a Jewish yeshiva. And he also worked, believe it or not, because he learned Hebrew and he became so good. It's amazing. And he also taught Hebrew in the U.S. Army. He's become a citizen. He also works for Stand With Us, and he will be very shortly joining our team. And I just can't wait until he tries to get into Ilhan Omar's office with his name. He'll probably have more success than I
think he'll have a little bit more sway there.
Right. And he could actually, be incredibly helpful. But he also was very, very supportive through the web, through Facebook, and he saw, it's like Plato's cave. There was light, and it wasn't just shadows on the wall, and he's seen the light. So
beautiful. Jerry, go ahead.
Sarah, you mentioned that you were at this event at the White House. How supportive has the Trump administration been?
I think they have been very supportive. I mean, I know that Jared Kushner, Jason Greenblatt, David Friedman, Avi Berkowitz, Brian Hook, all of these people have been traveling the world, cementing and making over the table those relationships between the Muslim governments and the state of Israel that have been heretofore under the table. And I think that they're, they worked very, very hard for this. And so I think, although, a lot of people love to criticize this administration, we have to be unbelievably grateful. This is a historic, a monumental deal. And they worked very, very hard for this. And I think, it's something that we know that the Trump administration has been working incredibly hard on.
So what do you think are the next low-hanging fruit to drop in this normalization process?
I think there's a betting pool. There certainly is in my office. It might be Bahrain, it might be the Sudan. I know that there was one member of the Sudanese Foreign Ministry who had to resign because he kind of, made the announcement a little bit too rapidly on Israeli media. But I am sure that there will be others. There are some rejectionist states that will always be rejectionist. And, one of the worst players right now is Qatar, who's spent billions and billions of dollars funding Hamas, Jabhat al-Nusra, you name it, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, so I think, and Qatar is very duplicitous. They've also spent millions and millions, if not billions of dollars funding American universities recently, even American K through 12 schools. It bothers me tremendously. So they're one of the rejectionist states, of course, Turkey under Erdogan, which is really upsetting. I think he wants to go back and reverse the Ataturk Revolution of 1919. I'm
gonna have to jump in right there, Sarah, if you wouldn't mind just a second. Hey guys, we're going to do a break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after these messages.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on The Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
It is the third and final segment of the show, and we're here with Sarah Stern with EMET, and we're having a great conversation. You guys that get to join us on YouTube, actually get privy to some information in the break that you probably won't get, but we try to do good. We try to bring the information from there. Jerry, go ahead.
Sarah, one of the quid pro quos of this normalization process with the UAE was, in fact, putting a stop, if you will, to the Israeli movement for sovereignty, an extension of its basic law, essentially, for territories that were included under the failed Oslo Accords. How temporary is that?
That's a difficult question. I have to tell you that nobody knows how long this is, but I do want to say that in this conversation that I was privy to, run by the Atlantic Council last Thursday with the Emirati foreign minister, he said it was temporary. He did not say that this is a cessation, that this is, a halt, a final halt. He said, for the time being. Now, I think in life, all great decisions usually are one which involves weighing the risks versus the benefits. And the benefit of a warm peace with the Emiratis far, far outweighs the risk of the loss of extending sovereignty right now into the communities of Judea and Samaria and the Jordan Valley. I think de facto, Israel has been in control of this land since 1967. I don't think they're about to lose that control. I know that the Jordanian king, King Abdullah, would absolutely be threatened, and his whole monarchy would be threatened if he were to lose control, or if there were a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. I think that right now the Israeli army is strong, and they've patrolled and they've controlled the borders. All of us can make a very compelling argument, a legal and a moral argument, as to why Israel is entitled to extend their basic law, her sovereignty over these areas. But at this point, I think something incredibly important has come along that could stabilize the region, and that promises to be a real bridge builder between Israel and so many other Gulf states, and particularly during the age of nuclear Iran. I think it's incredibly important that Israel and these Gulf Arab allies create a strong bond, a wall of fire against the Iranian nuclear threat. It's worth the trade-off for now.
I really appreciate how eloquently you stated that. There is something else to consider. The Arabs that live in this area, they don't want a PA-controlled area where their house is at and where they go to work every day. So we have a fantastic, tool that the Arabs that live in the area have security. They don't have to worry about being mugged or shot or killed going to work. They don't have to worry about being, being held hostage by their government and extorted for money. So look, there's a lot of stuff going on underneath. At some level, it's just going to take time before it bubbles to the top. And we have to be humans of great patience, of course. And obviously, you're never going to get anybody with greater patience than the Jewish people. Okay, so it's like we've held on for so long, we can hold on a little bit while longer. Jared, did you have something else that you wanted to ask?
Well, an observation. Our mutual friend Dan Diker has been pushing this topic now for the last 3 or 4 years, and including briefing folks at the White House about it as well. And this perhaps is a flowering of what he was talking about. And I think even he has indicated that this breakthrough is more important than the question of pushing ahead with the extension of the basic law to those areas that well deserve it at this point.
Exactly.
Now, there were some interesting folks that we mutually know who passed this past week. And it's in the context of not only outreach to our Christian allies for Israel, but it's also essentially perpetuating the leading edge of what we consider as the Zionist ethos. And I wonder if you could pay some memories of them, their importance, but also against the background of the fact that there's a vacuum now for leadership and education of American youths and even Israeli youths about the nature of what Zionism is all about.
Right. Just within the last 2 weeks or so, we lost two wonderful matriarchs who were real leaders in the Zionist battle. Helen Friedman, who was the executive director of AFC, Americans for Safe Israel, and Esther Levins, who was from Voices United for Israel. I just remember watching Helen Friedman on a Sunday morning talk show. I think it was a Christian talk show. And I said, and this was like in the 80s. And I said, this woman talks the truth. She talks the EMET. I loved her. And she raised a beautiful daughter, Judy Friedman Kadish, who has taken up the reins for AFC. And I'm sure she's leaving AFC, or she's left AFC in very, very good hands. And Esther Levins, I go back also to the early 80s when there was a group called WINPAC, Women's Pro-Israel National Political Action Committee. And I remember sitting next to her on a bus going from a hotel to the Capitol, and we were talking together, and she said to me, I have this idea of working with Christians. What do you think about it, Sarah? And she was a powerhouse. Her husband had been very influential with Senator Robert Dole from Kansas, and made him into a real Zionist. And she built bridges with the Christian community. And she had Voices United for Israel for so many years. And I think Joanne Magnuson, who was a former nun, was a very, very close friend of hers. And I think she will keep it up. But we need to educate our next generation. That is essential. I know Jewish identity really depends a lot on Jewish education. Right. We have to know what our people have gone through, particularly in the 20th century, both, in the Muslim and Arab world under the Dhimmi laws, and of course, the years and years of the Inquisitions and the gas chambers, and, basically ending up, with the horrific, the Holocaust, and without a sense of Jewish history and Jewish culture, Jewish identity, there's no chain of leadership. A link of the chain is severed. So I think it's very, very important that parents of young children educate their children, give them a sense of pride of what it is to be Jewish. Let them know what our history is. Let them know what's at stake. We need fighters for the future. I think America has almost been too good to our people. There's too much assimilation and too much intermarriage. And we need to bolster up our youth and let them know what's at stake.
Well, we have two icons we interviewed in late June. These are two high school honor graduates here in Northwest Florida who signed up for the Grin Zabar program, deferring their university education.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
That was, for us, kind of a warming moment. But the connection there was they also spent time in high school in Israel and getting exposed essentially to what Sahal means there, but also more important, essentially understanding why Israel exists.
And let me tell you, these young women both said that was the influential thing that caused them to rethink their relationship with Israel and what they want to do. And both of them said, I want to do my part. And that was so heartwarming for Jerry and I. We both got off with a big smile. By the way, Sarah, please tell our listeners how they can get more information about EMET, where they can go on the internet to be able to find out your information.
Okay, thank you so much. Please go to www.emetonline.org. EMET Online is one word. That's EMET online.org. We have webinars every week. This Thursday at 12 noon Eastern Time, we are having Ken Marcus, who was the Assistant Secretary for Education for Civil Rights, talking about civil rights for students, and particularly Jewish students, and our nation's school system. So,
well, we are so happy that EMET is doing such an amazing job, and I know that you are in the process of trying to bolster up the staff. I don't know if you're interested in people trying to help financially or whatever, but anything that you can do to help EMET, this would be a fantastic opportunity for us to inform our society and our fellow Jew. So look, we've come to the end of the road. Sarah, thank you so much for being a part of the show. And until next week at the same time, we all say shalom, shalom, and have a good week.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.